Welcome back, true believers and all you spectacular Spidey fans, to another very exciting episode of Marvel's Spider-Man 2 101, where in this video, assuming that you've already fully played through the main story of Marvel's Spider-Man 2 for yourself, is that we are going to be fully breaking down the entire ending of Marvel's Spider-Man 2, and of course, thoroughly analyze exactly what this ending means for the future of Insomniac's Spider-Man franchise going forward. So if you're someone like me who simply can't wait to see where this Spider-Man franchise goes next, then definitely be sure to thwip that like button and subscribe to the channel for any major Marvel Spider-Man 2 videos down the line. So for the sake of keeping things concise, is that we are going to be breaking down the main ending of Marvel Spider-Man 2's story, which does begin at the very last mission of the game with the Venom boss fight. And even though there is a lot more within Marvel Spider-Man 2's story that I do want to discuss, primarily relating to those incredible sequences that we did receive between both Peter and Mary Jane when we do have to fight her in a boss battle as Scream, which I think does a phenomenal job of further deepening the relationship between the two of them, as well as the game doing an incredible job of wrapping up the narrative arc for Martin Lee as Mr. Negative between both Peter and Miles, not to mention that insane reveal of the Chameleon showing up in Marvel Spider-Man 2, who may or may not appear in potential future Marvel Spider-Man 2 DLC, or even be saved for the inevitable third game. There's obviously too much to cover within this game's story in merely one video. But in regards to the game's main campaign, we obviously have to kick things off with the one and only Venom, where as it was revealed is that Harry Osborn himself ended up becoming the Venom symbiote's main host. And through Harry bonding completely with the symbiote itself, it then led to the main goal of Venom manifesting into a darker version of Harry's dream, which of course is wanting to heal the world. And as we ended up seeing within Marvel Spider-Man 2, this pretty much led us right into Web of Shadows 2.0, completely accompanied by a full-blown symbiote takeover, where coming from me personally as an absolute diehard fan of Spider-Man Web of Shadows, simply being able to see Insomniac's interpretation of this was nothing short of being utter madness in the best way possible. My only major complaint that I do have for this portion of the story is that I do wish that it lasted just a bit longer, especially considering that Venom as a whole is the ultimate threat that both Peter and Miles have to go up against at the very end of the game, and being able to further develop the symbiote invasion aspects about this game's story just a bit more would have been flat out perfect. But like we see is that this symbiote takeover doesn't last for long, because during this final confrontation between Venom and both of the Spider-Men is that the particle accelerator within the Emily May Foundation completely destroys the meteorite in which the symbiote came from, and with it ends up totally destroying all the other symbiotes left throughout Marvel's New York, including the one and only Venom symbiote that was on both Peter and Harry. Now, I have already thoroughly discussed in previous videos that even though we do see the Venom symbiote disintegrate here, we have received direct teases by Insomniac Games themselves and even the main actor of Venom of Tony Todd that we may end up seeing Venom return somehow down the line. So definitely make sure to check those videos out if you haven't already, which then leads to a sequence which I'm pretty sure every single one of us predicted was going to happen, is that Peter essentially had to kill Harry in order to stop the symbiote threat, which then would transition beautifully into Norman Osborn fully going insane after losing both his wife and his son, and in turn would directly set him up to become the Green Goblin as the main villain of the inevitable Marvel's Spider-Man 3. Well, in actuality, it turns out that we were only half correct, where even though Harry technically does die at one point, he ends up being revived by our main man Miles Morales. And even though he might be wearing a totally Adidas-sponsored Spider-Man suit, which I for one am not all that fond of, it still goes to show just how much a hero Miles is through and through.
That's what I'm talking about! That's why he's the MVP! That's why he's the GOAT! The GOAT!
Now, in my honest opinion, is that even though I thoroughly love Harry as a character, I do think that this ending would have been a lot more impactful if Harry had ended up dying completely. And instead, the real fate of Harry is that he's simply trapped within a coma. But whether or not that means that we might end up seeing even more of Harry down the line within Insomniac's franchise, either within a potential Venom spin-off game or even Marvel's Spider-Man 3, is still yet to be determined. So until Harry's narrative is either continued or resolved, we're just gonna have to stay tuned in the meantime. But the real fate of Harry might be worse than death, considering that even though Miles pretty much brought Harry back to life, he may in fact never wake up again given all the trauma that has been put on his body and brain, which as expected is something that Norman blames the Spider-Man wholeheartedly for, and has pretty much made it his goal to destroy the lives of both of the Spider-Men by any means necessary. But that's not before that we end up getting this statement from Norman where he does end up calling one of his Oscorp associates to quote-unquote get the G serum ready, where even though this does directly tease at the Green Goblin being the main antagonist of the inevitable Marvel Spider-Man 3, it is going to be very interesting to see what exactly Norman might do when he gets his hands on the G serum, where for one, he could end up injecting the G serum into Harry in order to try and cure his disease for good, which may end up turning Harry into a giant goblin monster like what we see in the Ultimate Spider-Man version of the character, or what I personally think is going to happen is that we are going to see Norman test out the G serum on himself before he ends up trying to give it to Harry, and instead of turning him into a giant green goblin-like monster, we are going to see him turn completely insane and pretty much take all the goblin weaponry that's lying around his house without the pumpkin bombs, the glider, and even the goblin mask, which then would make him turn into the classic Green Goblin that we all know and love.
Alright. You know,
I'm something of a scientist myself.
But what's crazier is that Green Goblin himself may not be the only main villain that we go up against within Marvel's Spider-Man 3. Because based on what we see in the first post-credit scene for Marvel's Spider-Man 2, is that we do receive a very welcome appearance from the one and only Dr. Otto Octavius, where as it's located, Otto is still fully imprisoned within the raft. And the only reason why Norman stopped by to pay Otto a visit is to simply learn the identities of both of the Spider-Man, considering that Otto obviously knows who Peter is. Although, it's never really been indicated exactly how Otto might know that Miles is Spider-Man, but given how smart of a person Otto is, I'm sure that he'd be able to figure it out one way or another. And given how much hatred Otto has for Norman, he is definitely more than happy to withhold that information from him. But just before the scene can end, we do have this one interaction between the two of them which sets everything in motion.
what are you writing?
The final chapter.
So, the final chapter that Otto is referring to is undoubtedly talking about the inevitable Marvel Spider-Man 3, which will more than likely be the conclusion of Insomniac's Spider-Man franchise. And even though I do not want Insomniac to stop making Spider-Man games anytime soon, I have no doubt that the final chapter within Insomniac's franchise is going to end on a high note, especially taking into consideration that it seems like both Green Goblin and Dr. Octopus might be the main antagonists of Marvel's Spider-Man 3. And given how wonderfully both Mark Rolston and William Sawyers play their respective characters of Norman Osborn and Otto Octavius, I think it's safe to say that we are going to be in for some utterly unreal performances by the time the third game drops. But on the flip side, one massive Spider-Man story from the comics, which I personally believe is not going to happen within Marvel's Spider-Man 3, which also heavily involves both Peter Parker and Dr. Octopus, is of course in relation to the one and only Superior Spider-Man storyline, where to take you all back to the year of 2018 is that the main reason that we did not see the black suit appear within any of the alternate costumes within Spider-Man PS4 is that Brian Intihar specifically stated himself that that costume needs its own dedicated storyline, which is exactly what we ended up getting within Marvel's Spider-Man 2. And for the case of Marvel's Spider-Man 2, one of Peter's most prominent suits within the game is none other than the Superior Spider-Man suit. So seeing that Insomniac directly incorporated the Superior Spider-Man suit within Marvel's Spider-Man 2 right off the bat tells me that they will not include the Superior Spider-Man storyline at any point within Marvel's Spider-Man 3, which I personally think is an absolutely goated choice for them, considering that I'm not too big a fan of the Superior Spider-Man storyline to begin with. But it is going to be very interesting to see exactly what Insomniac does with Doc Ock's return no matter what. And I for one cannot wait. Now moving on from all all the game's villains, let's finally talk about the story's main heroes. Where for the case of Peter Parker, especially given all the trauma that he went through within this game's main story with dealing with Kraven, the Black Suit, and his best friend becoming Venom, it's safe to say that our boy has definitely earned himself a break, which is exactly what he decides to do. Where after going through so much grief and also almost losing the love of his life and his best friend, Peter decides to actually take a step back from being Spider-Man in order to focus his efforts on rebuilding the Emily May Foundation, which I personally think is not only an absolutely beautiful way in order to honor Harry's legacy, but it also goes back to the very beginning of the game during the flashback with Aunt May, where Peter ends up learning the valuable lesson of balancing all the important things that matter to him within his life. And in this case, the Emily May Foundation might just be the biggest thing in his life at this very moment. And in the meantime, Miles will be the one fully taking care of the city. And for any of you out there who might be thinking that this ending means that Peter is retiring from being Spider-Man, I think we can all agree that that couldn't be further from the truth. It's pretty obvious to see that Peter Parker will for sure return within the inevitable Marvel Spider-Man 3, especially if it turns out that both Green Goblin and Doc Ock end up being the main villains for that game. But for now, it simply seems like that Peter is putting all of his personal priorities front and center, and will without a doubt be back sometime later in the future. Which now brings us to our other main character of Marvel Spider-Man 2's story, with none other than our main man, Miles Morales, who may or may not be the only other Spider-Person around while Peter is on break. Because like we see at the very end of the second post-credit scene, is that both Miles and Haley, who have now finally gotten into a relationship with one another, are directly introduced face to face to the man that Miles' mom Rio is currently dating, who she did mention previously earlier on within the game's story. And in a crazy twist, Rio is actually dating Albert Moon. And as it turns out, he just so happened to bring along his daughter named Cindy. And when I first saw this post-credit scene for myself, I was totally left with my jaw completely dropped. Now, for those of you who don't know, is that Cindy Moon as a character might just be one of the most interesting spider people within the entire Spider-Verse. Or as we all know Cindy better as, is Silk. Now, what makes Silk so interesting within the Spider-Man comics is that she was actually bitten by the same exact spider that bit Peter Parker. And even though Peter and Cindy's spider powers are relatively the same, the biggest factors that differentiate Silk from Spider-Man is that Silk actually has organic webbing similar to Toby, but that Cindy's webs actually emanate from her fingertips in comparison to Peter's wrist with his web shooters. And that her spider sense, or how she likes to call it with her silk sense, is actually far greater in comparison to Peter's spider sense. Not to mention that if you've read the comics, you'll know full well about the deeper connection that both Peter and Cindy have with one another due to their spider pheromones. And let's just say that aspect of the character, especially considering that it looks like that both Cindy and Miles appear to be of the same younger age, if anything like what we see in the comics between Peter and Cindy were to happen within Insomniac's universe, then I'm pretty sure that Peter would be going to jail for a very long time.
FBI, open up!
Now, the most interesting thing about Silk's inclusion within Marvel Spider-Man 2 is that this now makes it that there are 3 separate spider people roaming around Marvel's New York, or potentially more if you count the Spider-Verse mission. But because we now know that Silk is going to have an official presence within these Insomniac Spider-Man games, it now brings us to the question as to where exactly can we see her pop up next. Well, in my eyes, I do think that we could receive one of 2 things. The first of which is that we simply see Silk officially appear in full costume in the inevitable Marvel Spider-Man 3. That way, we would have Peter, Miles, and Cindy all teaming up together in order to defeat Green Goblin and Doc Ock, which would certainly make for one hell of a finale. Or on the flip side, I do think that there's a very good chance that we could end up seeing a completely standalone spin-off Silk game, just like what we saw previously with Miles Morales. That way, Insomniac would be able to fully develop Cindy's character within her own personal narrative, as well as fully develop develop her own unique moveset as Silk, where for me, I could definitely see Silk as being the most acrobatic and agile in comparison to the other Spider-Man. And for her combat abilities, considering that Peter utilized a lot of technology with his spider arms and his gadgets, and even had a lot more power this time around with the symbiote, and even Miles himself had a lot more Venom abilities to clock into this time around, I could definitely see Silk's fighting style feeling fairly similar to what we previously saw within the Amazing Universe in Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions, where in that game, the Amazing Spider-Man's combat system essentially focused purely on web-based combat. This included his webs pretty much turning into giant comic book-like shapes with that of fists, maces, hammers, and more. So seeing that Silk's webbing is entirely organic based, I have no doubt in my mind that Silk's inclusion within Insomniac's next Spider-Man project is going to be absolutely insane. And given everything that we currently know about so far, it's clear to see that the future of Insomniac's Spider-Man franchise is bigger and brighter than ever before. But until we end up hearing about what's next, that's the video I have for all you today, and please let me know your thoughts in the comments section down below. What do you think about the entire ending for Marvel's Spider-Man 2? And based on everything that occurred during the ending, which aspect about the future of Insomniac's Spider-Man franchise has you the most excited? Let me know what you think, be sure to leave a like on the video, and subscribe to the channel if you did enjoy, and for even more Marvel Spider-Man 2 videos like this down the line. Thank you all so much for watching, stay spectacular Spidey fans, and without further ado, peace out.